Hi everyone, this is Shannon Williams with Rancher, and thanks for joining our monthly training. Looks like we're going to have a big group today, so hopefully we'll be able to give you a good overview of Rancher and also answer all of your questions as we go along. I want to start today's training by introducing Denise Shannon. So Denise is our support manager here at Rancher, and she's going to be doing a lot of today's training. Denise, do you want to say hi?
Hi, everyone.
So Denise has been with us since the very beginning here at Rancher, and I'm Shannon Williams. I'm one of the co-founders and responsible for our marketing and customer activities. Today we have a lot to go over, and we've only scheduled the training for an hour. So hopefully we'll be able to cover all of your questions, get into the details of what Rancher does. But I wanted to start by just sort of laying out our objectives and what we try to accomplish in these monthly trainings. The real goal, is to give you a technical introduction to Rancher. And this won't be a marketing presentation. It won't be really about, why Rancher is so great, but rather how to use it, how to get started, and how to, both set up and then utilize the Rancher platform. Because of that, we're really not going to spend a lot of time in slides. The main focus will be on demonstration. So we'll be spending almost the entire time, in the Rancher application, showing you both how to deploy and configure it, and then how to use it. Because of that, one of the things, just keep in mind, things may break. These are all live systems that we're using, and be patient if we hit any issues. Probably the most important thing is, while we do have a very large group today, it's not so large that we don't want to take your individual questions. So in GoToWebinar, the tool we use, there is a sort of a questions tag that you should see, and we will be we'll be answering your questions there as we talk. One of the things that to probably be mindful of is we are recording this session. So if there's something that you feel like you want to see again or you want to share with your colleagues, we'll be recording this, posting it to YouTube. So just FYI, you will be able to review this later, go back over it if there's a piece you missed. But feel free to follow on at home if you've got your own Rancher implementation set up. The other thing is we've scheduled this for an hour, but these trainings sometimes run a little bit longer, and people have lots of questions. We block a little bit of extra time, so don't worry if we're coming up to the end of the hour and we haven't answered your question. It may be that we're about to cover that in the topic, or we're planning to address it towards the end of the session. Just don't worry, we will not leave unless your questions are answered. So feel free to write down your questions if there's issues you have, if you have bugs that you're aware of that you want updates on what's going on, give us the bug issue and we'll try to get an answer for you while we're going. So use the questions tab though. That's a great way for us to get information. Okay, so real quickly, because we have a reasonably large group, I thought I would ask about your familiarity with Rancher. So we basically we get people on these sessions that have never used Rancher before, and we get people who have been using it for 6 months and want to dive into detailed issues. So try to give us some idea of how grizzled you are, a cowboy, and kind of try to answer this question. So I've opened the poll. If you see it, you can sort of look in the GoToWebinar on the side. You should see and pick. Are you somebody who's used Rancher a little bit, or you're really kind of getting started from the beginning? So I'll give you a minute to put that in, and while we see these votes, it looks like most of the people here have some experience. I think we've got almost we've got 80–90% of the vote in. I'll give it just another minute if anyone else wants to vote. All right, and I'm going to close this. And whoops, let's see, I think I did the wrong thing. Let's go back here. I think I can close this poll. And hopefully you guys can see the answers. It looks like about 70% of you picked sort of the middle level, branded your first steer. So that's great. If you've got some experience with Rancher, that will help you follow along. We will definitely be digging into the basics, but feel free to fire in questions as we go if you have more advanced questions. And for the few of you out there who have chosen the John Wayne level of Bronco Buster, if you feel free to answer the questions. All right, so what are we going to cover in today's session? Our plan is, we want to get you familiar with some of the core resources that you can use. And obviously, Rancher is still a beta product. So as a project in an open source community, we really welcome people's participation, whether that's helping us to improve the docs or providing feedback or issues that you're finding. But there are a few great resources that we do recommend you use. I mean, Rancher is a relatively complex platform that has a lot of capabilities, and almost everyone, whether you're green or dusty, will find a lot of value in the docs. So please take a look, go over them. We will be referencing them a few times during the sessions today, but you can find all of the basics on how to use Rancher here. These are live docs, so they're constantly being updated, maintained. Every release that we put out, we're modifying the docs with new information, out of new fixes. You can also get a lot of value out of the forums. The forums are incredibly active. There's some amazing Rancher users out there who answer more questions than we do. But we monitor these. Denise, our engineers, they're always on the forums trying to understand if you need help or if you've hit a bug that we can then put into our QA process to hopefully fix in Rancher. So use the forums. They're a really great resource. The other one I would add is use GitHub, and within GitHub you'll find the Rancher project. That is where we track all open known issues. And so if you're seeing something that seems to be unexpected behavior, you might take a look at the issues section within GitHub and quickly see that that is something that's real. You've hit a real bug where either we've scheduled to fix it in the next release, or it's, maybe what you're looking for is more like a feature request, like, darn, why can't I do this really cool thing that would be useful? We may also have that sort of already documented as a common feature request, so give it a +1 to know that it's something you'd also like to see, and sometimes you can see that it's already been allocated to an upcoming release. So just FYI, those are some key resources you want to be aware of when using Rancher. In terms of the topics we have sort of set for today, the goal will be really to walk you through kind of start to finish deployment of Rancher and then deployment of an application using Rancher. So we're going to be talking about, we'll start with how to deploy and set up your Rancher management stack, and then dive into setting up access control, connecting up with GitHub or LDAP, whatever it is you're using for access control, AD. Then we'll start talking about sort of architecturally how Rancher is set up. We'll talk about the role of environments, how to create an environment, how to control access within an environment, what the different roles that are in an environment do. We'll talk briefly about attaching private registries. We'll show you how to connect to your private repo. We'll then dive into adding capacity into your environment, so creating resources. We'll go through the different ways to access the system. So we'll be talking about, we'll be mostly demoing through the UI just because it sort of helps people visualize what we're doing. But obviously, Rancher has a CLI and APIs that you can access as well. And then we'll go through, once you have your resources in an environment, we'll talk about deploying containers, creating stacks, using the catalog to deploy entire application stacks. We'll talk about the role of Compose and how we leverage that. And then, if we still have time, we'll go through some of the networking and storage stuff around load balancing, service discovery, how to choose from different networking models. We may talk a little bit about volumes and deploying storage services if we have time. So these are the kind of topics we're going to try and cover in today's session. So hopefully we'll hit the ones that are important to you. And as I said, if we're missing something, if there's something that's very specific that you'd like to know, please definitely ping us with questions, and we'll try to answer those as well. Okay, with no further ado, I'm going to pass the ball over to Denise, and she is going to start walking through the demonstration. So Denise, you are now the presenter.
Sorry, can you see my screen, Shannon?
I can. It looks great, and
Okay.
we've had a lot of people show up even since we started. So it looks like we're going to have quite a few questions today. So go for it. And
Okay,
everyone knows.
Oh,
just a reminder, the
yeah.
questions tab, for those of you who didn't already know, it's on the, it's in, looks like there was a question about how to find the questions. It's on the right-hand side when you log in.
Okay, so I'm gonna get started just because I've been doing these for a while now, and even the basics without all the new features we've added in the last couple of months have taken up to 45 minutes just to show. And so the faster we go, the more features I can show you that we've added over the last couple of months. So first things first is how to install Rancher. I know it sounds like the majority of you on the call have done it before, but for those who haven't yet really get into it, if you go to docs.rancher.com, under installing Rancher, you can see there's an installing Rancher server section. There's a single node, so basically having one setup of Rancher. We have one tested version of how to set up HA. We're working on our HA story as we get towards GA, so that's still kind of in flux to make it easier. How to do it with SSL, and how if you wanted to set up Rancher server and then basically cut it off for any internet access, how to set it up. So in my demonstration today, I will basically go through a single node, so having one Rancher server container running, and basically I have a Linux machine in a VM in GC right now that's already started up. And here, if I do a Docker PS, you can see my Rancher server container is already running. All I did was run this command. After a little bit, the IP address of my host, so my VM, will have displayed basically the Rancher server UI at the 8080 port. So that's where in this my web browser, you can see I've gone to there. A couple other things if you wanted to set up one. So we'll cover access control, or basically how to authentication for your Rancher server instance. If you wanted to do TLS, there's a couple things you need to do when you set up Rancher server. There are different options to bind mount a MySQL volume, how to use an external database, how to run behind a proxy. So we have some notes there if any of those situations are what you're looking for, but otherwise I'm going to just do a basic install, a plain vanilla install, which I already have running. And if I go back to here, you can see I only put it up about 24 minutes ago, and I'm running our latest version of 51. One of the things real quick is how do you find out if we have new versions of Rancher coming out. If you go to our forums at Rancher, you can go to the announcements tab. If you start over here, if you watch it, basically we only use this category to announce Rancher or Rancher OS releases, and then it shows you, I'll give you a quick show of basically it tells us if the version numbers have changed, what are the features we've added, what are maybe issues we know about, and what major bug fixes have gone through. So I highly advise people, you just watch this, you'll just get one email. Usually we do a release. We aim to do a release at least every 2 weeks. So please feel free to look at that. Let's go back into Rancher itself. Now that we have it up and running, one of the things to know is basically the UI is just a pretty display of how we use our API. And so basically anything that you can do in the UI, you can find an API call that's related to it. And so right now, with access control not configured, basically your setup is open to the whole world. So anyone out there, you could go into this URL right now, and you could actually start playing around with my Rancher server instance. So the first thing I always recommend is you should authenticate or turn on access control. So you can either click on access control here under admin. That's also where you can find access control. So in access control, the different authentication methods we support. One is Active Directory. We have GitHub. We have local. Local is where you would basically create your own accounts for users to be able to log in. And then we also support Open LDAP. I'll just do local authentication because it's easiest to show in a demo. Put in my information, takes a little bit, but it will automatically basically log you in. You can see my avatar here. If I go here, you can see that I'm now logged into the renter server instance. So now if any of you out there tried to access my renter server UI or even API, you would be required to provide a password. So under the admin tab, as the first person who has logged in or turned on access control, I'm automatically set as an admin. You can see under the accounts, you can see it's 187, that's me. That's basically what's turned on access control. If I wanted to add users, so if I wanted to add in Shannon to my setup, I could add him as an account. I could add him as a user or an admin. The only difference is whether or not you get access to this admin tab. And I'll cover over what's in this admin tab in a little bit. So I'm just going to make Shannon a user just because I don't want him to log in and start messing up with my system. Put that in, and so here you can add however many accounts you have. So if you have chosen to do any authentication of the Active Directory, Open LDAP, or GitHub, after someone logs in, that's when you have the ability to be able to basically grant them admin privileges. They'll automatically get logged into Rancher Server as a user by default. It's a little different than local because with local authentication, we are adding the accounts, and at that time you can decide whether or not they're an admin or user, whereas with the other ones, you have to wait until that person logs into Rancher Server to be able to grant them admin access. So now let's cover what does the admin have versus what a regular user. So here we have, this is a more recent feature in, I think the latest version actually is this audit log, where basically as you make changes or add and create host services, we provide a log of, who is the user who's doing this. This is starting to help, it really helps users, kind of pinpoint what's going on. I know as we get into it, as you share your environments with other users and you see something has gone wrong as an admin, you can kind of go pinpoint and figure out who was the one that made that change so that, you can track that person down and kind of ask, why they did this or that. Another useful tab for troubleshooting is processes. So here you can see all the processes that have been done, and these ones have all exited. So sometimes if you get an instance where something is stuck or Rancher Server slowing down, I recommend looking at the processes tab to see. Usually the reason why we see those is because they're processes that for whatever reason cannot actually end. And so they get kind of trapped in here, and so you can investigate kind of how to troubleshoot your Rancher Server. I've covered over accounts. Because we have local authentication, this is the only one that would basically allow you to add accounts. With the other authentication providers, you basically invite people here, and then you wouldn't actually be able to add any accounts because obviously Rancher wouldn't manage, say, your LDAP system access control. And finally, we have a settings page. So in the settings page, one of them is the host registration URL. So this is where and how your Rancher agents, which are containers deployed on hosts that you're going to add into your Rancher Server, that's how those Rancher agents are going to connect to Rancher Server. We have our catalog options, and I'm going to gloss over this now and I'll come back to it, but basically we have a catalog of templates for users to easily deploy stacks, which contain services. We'll come back to what are some things, and then we have this virtual machine enabled or disabled. This is actually something that's not yet actually available or really tested. So, I mean, we've kind of shown it a little prematurely, but just want to let you know it's there. But, you could try and play with it, but it's not something we've actually really supported yet. So that is the admin tab and everything covered. The next step is probably, so under the accounts and access control, that's kind of where there's I imagine it as like 2 layers of authentication, and I know this really kind of trips people up, so I really want to spend some time to describe it. So the first level of authentication is basically if you even have access to the site. So if you added someone, if I created this account for Shannon, if he logs in, he'll get access to the site, but he doesn't actually have access to my environment, and I'll cover the environment in a sec. Same thing with, I think with GitHub, you can invite people specifically to the site, but that doesn't necessarily mean they have access to your environment. And what your environment is basically how we isolate different environments, I hate to use the same word, between basically where your resources, where your hosts and services are from, one setup and another. So here I'll go to managing environments to give you a show of what we have. So immediately when you log in, you have this default environment. You're allowed to, the first person who logs in and adds access control gets this default environment. You can change the name. You can do anything you want with the default environment. You can add more environments. So I can add like a lab environment. I could add Shannon to it. Under each environment, there are different roles for it. So we have an owner role, so that's the person who can basically edit the membership level. So if I want to add more people, remove people, if I want to change their role, only owners can do that. As a member, you basically have access to the environment, and you can do pretty much anything else in the environment except for changing the membership level. We also have a restricted and a read-only role. So a read-only role is you can look at everything that's going on inside. You can look at the host. You can look at the stacks and services. You can see everything. But if you actually tried, in the UI, it might be a little deceiving because you might be able to, it might show you that, you could actually perform some actions. But in reality, like if you actually went to click on, say, deleting something or whatever, that would actually it would give you a restricted and tell you that you're not allowed to do that. And finally, we have a restricted mode, and so that is where you would have all the actions available on our applications page. So basically, you would have the ability to add stacks and services, containers onto in your environment. But that person would have no ability to change anything regarding your host. So they wouldn't be able to delete or add new hosts into the environment. So it's just a different level of security there. So I can, like I said, you have this default environment. So instead of creating a new environment to add Shannon, I could have just come to here. If I don't want to make a new one, I could add him here. I could say I actually only want him to look around but not actually play with anything. And there. So there are different environments that you can add. So that's kind of what I think is the second layer of security, where the first one of accounts, that's basically who is allowed into Rancher Server, and then the environment level is where you define who you want to be able to manipulate or play with the resources and services that you have. By default, if you ever add anyone to your environment, so say I used GitHub authentication, if I had added Shannon to my default environment, it would automatically add him basically at the account level to say you now have access to the Rancher Server site. Okay, so what is this environment and what are these resources she keeps talking about? When you first log in, you'll usually get prompted to adding your first host and adding your first service. So you can't, launch any services until you have a host to actually deploy the Docker containers on. So I will add some hosts here. The very first time that you are trying to add a host, it will ask you for what that host registration URL. Once again, that's basically the URL that the Rancher agents can communicate with the Rancher Server API. One note is that I know in GitHub authentication, we usually don't show that page just because it's assumed that your URL would be the same as what you've used in GitHub to authenticate your application. Now for the add host page, we have a variety of different cloud providers. What we've done is basically created a nice UI to be able to show how to launch a Docker machine command. So, I often get questions in GitHub or the forums, like, oh, I'm having issues with this driver in the UI. You know, how can I get it to work? Usually what I ask them is, you know, if you are having issues in a UI, try it out using a Docker machine command to see, you know, all your options that you're setting up are correctly. And if you can launch it in Docker machine and you cannot launch it in the UI, then there's probably maybe an issue with Rancher, and that's when you should file an issue. But like, if you haven't done that test or example to see if it actually works in Docker machine with the assumptions you've made, then it might not work out. Here I'm going to quickly launch a couple hosts in DigitalOcean. It's the easiest one, quickest one. I'm going to pause my screen as I grab my access key. And the reason why I like to demo with DigitalOcean is because they don't have any you know, security groups that I have to fiddle with to be able to get Rancher server, or at least the host, running. I'll create some small instances. This is just for a demo. Pick my area. Here I'm going to add some labels. So I'm going to add a label to indicate these are all my DigitalOcean hosts. And then with the support of, I think it's version 0.5.2 of Docker Machine, we now have added the information about Docker Engine and options that that version of Docker Machine now supports. So I'm going to create the, what is this going to do? So basically, we've called that Docker Machine command, and what we will do is call the Docker Machine command, create the DigitalOcean droplet, then Rancher server is going to SSH into the DigitalOcean droplet. We're going to install the Rancher agent container, and then once that gets set up and Rancher agent can start communicating with Rancher server, they will show up as some hosts on our page. While this goes up, because you know I know Docker Machine and getting droplets up take a little bit, I've already prepared a couple hosts here. They're just called Denise Demo Agent 1, 2, and 3 on GCE. So if you had any hosts, you know, in GCE or your own internal servers that you want to add it in, you can go to this custom command to add a host. And here you can see this is basically the Rancher agent command that we are running whenever we add a Rancher agent for the server. The unique parts here probably is that this part of the command itself within the Docker run command is, you know, the host registration URL that we set earlier. And then this key over here is basically which environment you're going to add it into. So before I do it, I'm going to add some labels here, just because on my hosts, all I've done, let's show you my hosts, one of them real quick. All I've done before we even started is pre-pull some images. You can see I haven't added anything or started anything. All I did was pre-pull some images because it makes it just easier and quicker for the demo where we don't have to wait to pull those images. I'm going to put some labels on here, and I'll show you what the labels do later, but basically it allows you to schedule your services onto specific hosts. And I'm putting these labels on because since I pre-pulled those images, I'd rather have my application, my services run on those hosts so that it will go faster for the demo purposes. Copy and paste, get that started. One of my DigitalOcean hosts. One thing to note of, if you get some, what's it called? If you get some errors in when you launch a Docker machine, so the UI commands, a lot of the times the errors are not actually related to Rancher itself. They're going to be Docker machine generated errors. So if you see that, you can see. So now we have all 6 hosts. You can see I have my labels on each of my hosts. And now we're going to start, now that we have some hosts to be able to deploy some services, let's get some services going. So I'm going to do a really simple service first. It's going to be a blog service, I'm going to use the ghost image. I'm going to expose the port that is exposed on the container onto the host so that I can actually see the blog container from the whatever host IP that the container is run on. I'm going to say always run. For the scale, we have two options. You can run however many containers you want. You can also just say always run instance of this container on every host. The reason why I like to usually use always run one instance, what we call global scale, for any time you use a port mapping is basically because, you know, if you end up choosing a scale that's higher than the number of available hosts, then your service will get stuck in a degraded state where basically it can't actually launch all the containers you've asked it to launch. So I'm going to always run on instance, and then before, you know how I added that host label onto a couple of my hosts, I'm going to take advantage of those labels to say, oops, not under labels, under scheduling, I want to say I want to run on every host that matches the rules that say that, you know, I want my blog to be on those. So you can create basically a label as a key value pair. You can create as many key value pairs on you want your hosts to allow you to schedule, or determine what hosts you don't want scheduled on. So, you know, we have affinity rules, we have hard, and then if you don't use a host label, I think, or if you don't use a global scale, there's soft and hard affinity rules that can be done. So let's create this one, and then I'm going to start my service. So here you can see the stack that my first service is usually placed into is the default stack. A stack is basically a way that you can organize the different services that you'll have within one application. So, you know, it makes it a little cleaner to be able to organize them into groups of your choosing, so that if you wanted to investigate more about one specific application, all your services in the application would be in that one stack. Here you can see my blog service is now active, so now that's running. One of the newest features I love in the new UI that we've done is that you could click on the ports that we've exposed, and it actually automatically just goes into one of the host IPs to the port to be able to see it right away. For this service, as you can see, there are 3 containers, so it's actually on 3 different hosts. If I click on this little eye, that will give you kind of like a high-level information summary of the service itself. You can see, you know, what image, commands you use. You can, you know, do the different options. We have the individual specific containers related to the service. You can, one of the great things is you could right-click on the container to do specific actions on the container itself. So if I had one container that, for whatever reason, was not running correctly, you could, you know, go into that specific container. Here you can see these are all the host IPs and ports that are open. So you could click on these individually, and it will go there. I'm going to write an enhancement request to say if you click on one of these, it should open a new tab, because I didn't like how it got jumped out. So you could either, this is a great thing, at least at a high level of, you know, usually what you're looking for if there's any questions you have on your service. If you wanted to look at a detailed view of it, there's just a couple more information about your service. It shows you for the container view, it shows you, you know, the stats of your container, it shows you, you know, what the IP address of each container is. It shows you, once again, you can find the ports, the host IPs for each individual port. You can see what labels have been added to your container. And then if you had links to other containers, this is where you'd see them. So this is like a really basic service in case you want to just start playing around with Rancher. I'm going to move on to kind of a slightly, not complicated, one that uses our load balancer. I'm going to create a new stack for our load balancer. I'm going to first add the service to load balance. I'm going to use a coworker's image that she has. Basically, all she's done is used the NGNX image as the base, and she has a URL on that in her image that basically will share what the container ID is. I think that's all I need to do to create it. Oh, the only thing I would have done is probably add the scale to make it higher because I want to be able to show load balancing. So you can, find the actions here. You can click on edit. You can change the scale. I'll put 9. Save it, and then I'm going to start it. Sorry, double-clicked very quickly, so then now it's stopping. Now maybe my double-click caused a small issue. Let's see. Oh, they're still going. So it has determined to put all my apps onto my DigitalOcean host, as you can see. Oh, there's one here on one of my GC instances. So one of the things I forgot to mention, so the very first time you add a container onto a host or launch a service that will basically bring up the first container onto the host, we add something called a network agent container onto your host. In the Docker list of containers on that host is called a Rancher agent instance. That's what we use for our network agent. That's what we use for our load balancers. But basically, this container is what we use to be able to communicate across different hosts. So that's how you have cross-host communication. So that's why it wouldn't matter, which host your services get launched onto, because as long as you have enabled ports 500 and 4500 UDP ports, then the host should be able to communicate with each other. Go back. Here you can see that any stacks that have any issues with their services end up in this degraded state. You can arrange your stacks by state or name. I'm going to start this up again just so it can get going. While that's going, I'm going to add my load balancer. So our load balancer uses HA proxy software. Just call it load balancer. I'm going to give it a semi-port. I'm going to put in the port 80. That's what's exposed on the container itself. I'm going to say I want to target my NGNX app. So for the load balancer, as as more and more people have used it, we get more and more requests. So the load balancer has many different options. You could create what we call host name routing rules. So you could create it so that if you go to a specific host, a specific path, even a specific source port, that's how it will determine which target you want. So you could have one load balancer for multiple targets. We recently added wildcard matching for the request host. Really, I recommend in the Rancher documentation, we try and keep it up to date as we add new features. If you go onto Rancher UI, we kind of arranged it based on how the UI is done. If you go adding load balancers, it will cover all the different options of the load balancers we've added, how it works. So just something to look into.
Denise, there was a question that came in where someone was asking, what is the logic to distribute the containers? Like, how is the distribution logic by default, and then how do you define the scheduling policies? Do you want to touch on that, or are you going to?
I can cover that. I can cover that. So by default, what it does is it picks the hosts, like it picks the host that has the least number of containers. So it doesn't necessarily say like if your containers are really small and don't use up that much space or memory or whatever. It's not going by what's utilized in it. It's really going based on the number of containers on the host. That at least is my understanding of how we pick which host to deploy on. But kind of how I did in the scheduling rules of this blog post, if you want your applications run on specific hosts, a specific group of hosts, You can add in, there's like a whole kind of slew of ways to do it. You can add in host labels to say I only want them to be launched on specific hosts. In the scheduling rules, I'll go back to that tab again. You can pick rules. Once again, there's hard and soft affinity, so it could be must, should not. You could go based on host label. You could do containers that have labels, so you can see here in the tab here, for any services that you add, you could add your own labels if you wanted to organize them that way. You could do it based on the service names to say, like, I want it to be launched on any hosts that have a container from a service A, or you could do it with a container of a specific name as well. Hopefully that, I think, covers the question in terms of how do you decide which host or where to deploy your containers. It's kind of like you can either let Rancher do the work and decide for you out of all the hosts that you've added into your Rancher server, or you could add these labels, which is what most people do, to separate it. Another thing is if you had services that are going to leverage other services, or you want them always to say you want like 2 services to always be deployed together on the same host, you can add what's called a sidekick container. So basically you would have what we call the primary service, so that's the one that decides where you should launch a container. And then if you added a sidekick, basically that sidekick would be launched where anytime the primary service is launched, the sidekick is also launched with it. And it has a slightly different view, which I can show when we launch some catalog items, than just adding a host itself. Okay. Let's go back. Let's do this load balancer really quick. But yeah, well, I agree. For the load balancer, go to the docs, take a look at all your options that you can do. We just added, I think in this version, being able to, if you're really hands-on with your HA proxy config that you want to be able to touch, you can now add in your own custom global and default section. Let's get this up and get that activating. So there it is. Just going. So I was just checking to see why it said it was degraded. If I go into here to my port, so the host IP and the port, should connect to one of my NGINX apps. There's sometimes a slight delay when this is the first time that the hosts are basically using the Rancher managed network to start connecting with each other. So like a lot of the features that we've added are really only supported in the Rancher managed network, or sometimes it's supported if you use the hosts network and allow the Rancher DNS to be enabled. But here, if I kept refreshing the page, it wouldn't really tell you anything because we would keep seeing this welcome to NGINX page, and eventually it'd get cached. But if I go to that special URL that I was telling you guys about, you can see this is one of the container IDs. If I refresh, you can see it's a different container ID, and as it goes through, it basically will go, I believe the algorithm for at least load balancing is it goes into one host, and then it will go through all the containers on that host before it's a round robin. So then it will then go to the next host and pick all the containers on that host, and then so forth. So that's kind of how the load
questions that came in, Denise, just real quickly. One on the HA proxy configuration. I'm just asking about, how easy is it to customize the HA proxy configuration? So I don't know if you want to just touch on that briefly.
Yeah, you can do anything you want to put in the global and default section that's supported in basically HA proxy. You can add that in. So basically, it will be appended to whatever default that we already have. I mean, that's the extent of I understand about customization. I mean, we obviously do some things for, if you're looking at how to customize how to direct your traffic to the specific services, we've added a bunch of those options within, being able to have your own request path, hosts, source port. You can do SSL. There's kind of a lot of the, at least what normally people ask is already by default, and then if you want that extra level of customization, you could add it onto the global and default section. I'm hoping that can answer the question on that one. Is there any other ones?
Yeah, there's another question that goes back to the scheduling we talked about a little bit earlier. As a follow-up question to the earlier question was asking about, is it possible to shift a container from one host to another with Rancher? And I can chat about that. Right now, in Docker, there's work on dynamic live migration of containers between hosts, and we're heavily participating in that, but it's not available yet. So right now, the way you would shift a container from one host to another is to restart it and restart that container with a new scheduling rule. So that's really the only way. So once you've started a container, there's no concept of live migration yet in containers that would allow you to do this, but it absolutely is coming. I think by certainly, I don't think it'll be in the next release of Docker, though there's a chance, but possibly in the following release of that, you'll start to see the ability to live migrate. And obviously, with Rancher, that live migration will work across any containers within an environment, even if those containers are on different clouds or different availability zones. So yes, good question on that one. And then one other question, it was Anthony asked that, why is there the small delay when you add a new Nginx in the load balancer and then try to refresh the page? Do you want to touch on that, Denise?
Yeah, I can cover that. So basically, there's a known delay basically the first time. So if I come into the setup here where if I try and basically set up the cross-host communication, so if I try and ping, the first time I try and ping from this host to this host, if they're not there's a small, it's like a 4-second delay, I think, or at least 4 packets get lost. I don't know how quickly the packets get sent before the communication gets set up. It's basically, I think, setting up the managed network between all the hosts. Once that's in place, the delay is gone. So there is a known issue that there is an initial ping delay. So basically, the way the managed network is obviously my DigitalOcean host. I mean, I can ping. Let's see. If I exec into one of my DigitalOcean hosts, I can ping. I'm going to ping this network agent. This one is one of my GCE hosts. I know that just because we order them based on naming, and so because of how I've named everything, all the GCE hosts are clumped together, and all my DigitalOcean hosts will be clumped together. If I ping it, you can see this is the first time probably that this host has actually pinged the other one, and there was that delay, that same probably amount of time of delay between, host A and host B. So that's really what the load balancer is doing, is it's just setting up that initial communication between the two hosts. Once all the hosts are kind of joined in being able to communicate across with each other, then that delay would be immediately gone. Hope that answers that question. Okay. I still have a ton to cover, and I know there's only 10 minutes left, so I'm getting a little nervous, but we'll keep going. So this is kind of I'd say the bare bones of, or the majority of what you can do in terms of the UI, in terms of adding services and stacks, the basics. If you have further questions, always look at the docs is what I recommend. So this is kind of the UI. I want to show people where the API is located, because I know there are people who like to do that. So if you go into your little drop down of your avatar, you can find the API and keys. Here you can click on here, and since I'm automatically already logged into Rancher Server, I can access the API. If I go into a different browser, I grab this API endpoint, I'm going to end up being prompted for a name and password. So that's just to re-verify the fact that once you turn on access control, some stranger can't go and change anything you've got going on in your Rancher Server. In our docs, we've just added recently a little more detail about how the API works. A little bit about the structure. I would say it's definitely still V1 of how to dock the V1 API. So take it as you can. I, unfortunately, am not the greatest user of the API. I usually use Rancher in the UI form or what we're going to go over next in Rancher Compose. Those are my two primary ways, so I'm not the best to demo the API, but for those who are looking into it, this is what you can find. Next, we have something called Rancher Compose. So Rancher Compose is essentially a Docker Compose CLI equivalent for Rancher specifically. So the theory is that any Docker Compose file that you have out there, you should be able to use a Rancher Compose command to be able to populate it into Rancher itself. We were the main contributors to, there's basically a Golang interpretation of Docker Compose that is now part of the Compose, it's part of the libcompose project in Docker, and that is where we primarily have Rancher Compose based on. So you can download the CLI based on your machine. I have a Mac, so I'll download it there. I'm going to open it up, and it's actually going to open up a second one because I already had it downloaded. I'm going to navigate to where I've downloaded it and opened it up. This is my other one that I already had downloaded. I have some other files that I usually test with. And see here, this is Docker Compose of something that I was testing out some links and sidekicks. So I'll just get rid of this. One of the cool things is, if you're new to Rancher, if you're new to Docker, using the UI is a great way to get started. Basically, you could set up everything you want in the UI, and then you could go into your stack. You can then grab the equivalent Docker Compose YAML and the Rancher Compose YAML. So the Docker Compose YAML is something that even if you did a Docker Compose up, that's everything, you should still be able to launch it in Docker Compose. And then the Rancher Compose usually tends to have some information that's going to be Rancher specific, like for example, scale that's not supported in Docker Compose, health checks that we have enabled. So automatically for load balancers, we have a health check enabled so that if your load balancer, if your host was to go down, the load balancer would know to go reschedule on a different host so that it was constantly up. I'm going to take basically that Docker Compose we have over there. I'm going to take the equivalent Rancher Compose, pop it in here. Now to reuse Rancher Compose, there are a couple of things that you would want to set up before you start using Rancher Compose. So there's the URL, your access key, and your secret key. So basically, your URL is, where is your Rancher server hosted? You want to make sure you include the 88 port, otherwise you won't know where the Rancher server container is on your host. You can create an API key, where it will basically be your access key and secret key to be able to get into that specific environment. Everything is environment driven when you want to launch services. And then you can define what you want your stack name, so I'll call it my compose test. And then you can do just like a Docker Compose up, it's the equivalent of a Rancher Compose up. So we try and keep it in line with whatever features that are added in Docker Compose. They try and add it into libcompose. Sometimes it's a little delayed. And then as soon as it gets added in libcompose, we always try and incorporate it into the next version of Rancher Compose. So you can launch this up, close this, go to our applications page. You can see our compose test is going up, and it's just starting up first. Start up the application, and then it's going to start the load balancer. So that is a very high-level, quick way of showing you, at least it's going to take a little bit as it downloads everything. of how to use rancher compose. There are lots of commands for rancher compose. So in lieu of time, I'm just going to point you to where it is in the docs. Using rancher compose talks about, you could either set those URL, access keys, secret keys in the command every time, which I do only because I play with so many different setups of rancher server, but usually most people are not going to be like me. So we, encourage you to set up environment variables so that you could just run, rancher compose commands without requiring those additional items in your command line. Talks about the different commands and options that we have, how to set up, we have those, how to set up a load balancer, what's the equivalent of doing the load balancer in Docker Compose file versus what we have in the UI. Another easy way is, like I showed you earlier, just create it in how you want it set up in the UI, and then you can always export that, rancher compose to get at least started or familiar with the rancher compose syntax, the YAML files that we're going to do. Talks about how to do the scheduling rules, how to use those labels. One of the big things I can cover even in the UI is how to upgrade services. So in the UI, you can do, once a service is running, you can upgrade it. And here, this is great for people who, if you have different versions or tags for your image, you could set your image to the new tag, and then it will automatically upgrade that service you have to that new image. So basically, remove all the old images, old containers, and launch new containers with your new image. And it will keep intact basically any relationships that you've created in Rancher. So say my load balancer is deploying to this application, it would keep that relationship in the sense that even though the containers are being replaced with new containers, my load balancer will now be able to speak to those new containers. So we have that kind of support also in Rancher Compose under upgrading services. So what I described in the UI is called an in-service upgrade. That's what we refer to it, where it's basically you're making changes to the existing service and it's just deploying new containers for that service. We also have something called a rolling upgrade, which is a little further down, where basically you would create a brand new service to replace your old service. Most people prefer the in-service one, but that's an option out there. Talks about how to build with S3, and just like if you have some environment variables on the host that you're running Rancher Compose, how you can do environment interpolation. So that's a very high level and very quick view of Rancher Compose. Another couple cool things about Rancher Compose, I know like Shannon was begging for this feature a long time ago, is, instead of having to actually use the CLI, you could just create stacks and dump in your Docker Compose and related Rancher Compose and create them this way. That's an easy way to get into it. And so those are all the stacks in Rancher Compose. So I'm going to start covering some new features, or the catalog, which is like another great thing. So basically, a catalog is all these templates that we've had a lot of contributions to, have added into our repo, which allows you to launch basically some services that are a little more complicated to set up in either Docker Compose or even in just using the UI itself. So we've created these, tested version of templates of how to get them up and running yourself. The cool thing of, I think, well, there's many cool things with the catalog, I think. So here you have, this is basically our public repo of catalog items that we support, basically all the different templates. If we go into, where is it, Elasticsearch, this one's a good one because I know we have different versions of it going on or showing. So you can, as you push out new versions, Rancher, as we push out new versions, Rancher will then indicate like, oh, a new version's available. You can upgrade if you want to. It's an option. It basically creates a new stack, and then for every service, there'll be different configuration options. And to kind of give you an idea of what I meant by, like, we've done the work to simplify it, this is like the example Docker Compose YAML that you would need to get set up to be able to have Elasticsearch running. And obviously, as a new user, it might be difficult for you to figure out all these different ways of how to get it all integrated together. So it's kind of great that we created all these templates. One of the newest features, so a catalog has been there actually for a couple of releases now. So one of the newer ones is you can, excuse me, go into the settings, and you could actually build your own catalog URL. So basically, it's a GitHub repo that allows you, if you create it in the same format, you could add it to your Rancher setup. In the Rancher documentation, it's kind of hidden. I need to figure out a better way to elevate it more. Is under configuration, under settings, under catalog. That's where we talk about how you would set up your own private catalog. I'm going to probably move it to a more prominent place because I know that's been out there in terms of questions. But that's for those who want to know of how you could add different catalogs. And then when you could add, you could remove the Rancher catalog and add your own. You could have multiple catalogs. And so then I think as you add in catalogs, there's a little, I've seen it before, a little button that would say if you wanted to search only a specific catalog, you can, I don't have the time to really launch too many of them. But we can, I'll start launching the Elasticsearch so everyone can kind of see what the upgrade looks like, the UI. I'm going to purposely pick the old one. You can see immediately that an upgrade button is available.
Hey Denise, one of the questions someone asked, there's a couple questions that came in. One is, do you miss out on anything when you run Rancher on premise? And I think the question is, like, I'm assuming, so maybe I can answer the first half. But if you're just running Rancher with it, you know, on premise, but it has internet access, then no. I mean, Rancher is designed to run on premise. You can certainly run it on premise without any issues. If you have to run it behind a firewall with no internet access in a fully isolated type of way, you can definitely do that as well. But I'm just wondering if you miss out on anything there that, you know, like for instance, you wouldn't be able to access obviously the Rancher catalog because it's a GitHub repo that we're connecting up to. So you need to, you know, sort of clone it and run it behind the firewall if you wanted to have access to it if you had no internet access. But other than that, you know, you wouldn't be able to access Docker Hub and other things, but you certainly could access a private repo that you were running in Rancher or somewhere else. There's a lot of ways you could run this. I mean, I know a lot of government agencies and others that run Rancher behind the firewall, you know, isolated away from anything else. So yeah, I think you can certainly get away with it. And I believe we have some documentation on that, don't we, Denise?
I'm sorry. I was reading the other questions while you were talking. I apologize.
That's okay. No, I think we have some documentation on running Rancher without internet access.
Yes, we do. Yes. Yeah. So under installing Rancher server, so there's no internet access. So basically the way you can do it is you can create your own private registry. You'd have to obviously download the images for that server of Rancher. So like whenever we put any announcements out there, we always show what are the image, I'll show you an example real here quick of what versions of Rancher server, Rancher Agent Instance, and Rancher Compose that are kind of, this is like the tested combination of them. And so to run Rancher without internet access, you basically would have to create your own private registry and essentially pull these images into your private registry so you would have access to that. And then after that, there shouldn't be anything that you would require. Right. I think that's kind of what you're looking for. So if you want to read more about it, it's under installing Rancher server, and then the no internet access. That's probably how you do like on-premise.
There's kind of another question that falls in that same bucket. Joe was asking about how well Rancher server scales. Is there a limit to the number of Rancher hosts we can add to an HA Rancher server setup? And so there's two questions. There's sort of like, is there a theoretical limit and is there a tested limit? So right now we test with hundreds of hosts. That's sort of the level of scale we test with. I know a few other people are using Rancher with thousands of hosts. But the design goal when we get to GA is for Rancher to be able to handle tens or hundreds of thousands of hosts. So we've been working with some users that have that type of scale that they're looking to support with Rancher. So I think, some of that, we know there are some issues if you get into the, really, really large scale right now that we still need to address before we GA the product. But I think if you're talking about hundreds or even maybe a low number of thousands of hosts, you shouldn't see any issue. And obviously Rancher is designed to horizontally scale, but there are some issues that are defined that I know you can probably see in GitHub. So feel free, Joe. If you're interested in chatting about this further, I can connect you with the team working on scaling Rancher, and they can give you some guidelines and sort of incorporate you into the team of really large users who are interested in scaling Rancher to really large levels. You can just email me at shannon@rancher.com, and I can help you connect to those. But thanks for the great question. The last question was about Gluster, Denise. I think maybe the one we're reading. Do you want to try and address that?
I'm trying to launch a Gluster FS so I can show it. That's what I did. That's what I was reading. Basically, right now I'm just going to give some, so Gluster FS along with Convoy Gluster. So I think that's what Wolfgang was talking about, where he can't see when he adds volumes. Where there are some, I know we have some event triggers missing on the API side, so the UI doesn't know to refresh. So sometimes you need to refresh the page a couple times for it to actually register. I know there's been a lot of development over the last couple of weeks of how to enhance that experience of Gluster FS with Convoy Gluster, because we know, like, right now we didn't have, we really didn't want to figure out. We're against deleting things usually, just because of, in case there are any issues. But like a lot of people have been talking about how to delete volumes, and so that's being added in. We're gonna. I know if you, we're I think working to, be able to show the local volumes that are on the host where you have Gluster FS launched. That's one of the things I remember seeing, that enhancements is coming out. And so you're adding the volume thing. There is some issues tracking that, where basically you can add the volume and then it doesn't show up. But I think it only shows up when it actually gets used. So if you have a service that's using that volume, then the volumes end up showing up on the screen. So I know there is definitely some syncing issues. The volumes will exist, but they might not show up in the UI, and that's like an event trigger. So I hope, Wolfgang, that kind of answers what you're looking for. I can try and show a full example. It'll take a little bit because I have to launch Gluster FS, and that's going to get going. And then I can launch Convoy Gluster, and then I can use some service. I can launch some services using that. Okay, so first, I know for
Denise, while you're waiting for that to boot up, there's a question that Patrick asked that's relevant, and I just want to be mindful. I know we're over an hour, and many of you probably have to run. As I said before, we're going to record this, but we won't leave until your questions are answered. The question that Patrick asked was about the metadata service, and I think it's more of a feature enhancement than really a question, but it was a good one. He was saying, and for those of you who haven't seen the metadata service, it's a service in Rancher very similar to Amazon metadata service that allows you to sort of find information about the hosts, and we use it a lot in templates. But his question was, Rancher metadata offers info on containers within a service, but it lists all the containers, even those who are stopped or in other non-running states. Is it or will it be possible through the metadata to find only containers in the service that are in the running state? And this is something I know we've chatted a little bit about and enhancements. So Patrick, my request to you.
Can I interrupt real quick? So I'm surprised to hear that, because I know specifically yesterday that Darren was complaining that the Rancher metadata service didn't list the inactive containers. I think it did not. So I would need to check again. But I know there's been talk of either enabling or disabling. So now I'm not sure if I read did not or it says it did. of the running state. So there is talk about how I think there's probably an enhancement to probably isolate one of those two.
Yeah, it's a great request. I've heard it. It's one I've had a couple times. So Patrick, I'll also double check. I'm gonna just kind of send you my email address as well, and if you don't mind following up with me on it, we'll take a look and see if there already is an issue, or if you want to take a look in GitHub, see if there's already an issue request around this in the metadata service. And if not, certainly I think would be a great conversation to start on GitHub. It's something we do want to do.
I will tell you that the next version of Rancher is going to have a complete, there's big metadata service changes coming out in the next version. So if there's anyone out there on the call who's like playing around with it and you're using the latest version in your whatever setups, please be warned that most likely in the next version it will be broken, because I know in our notes, in our at least recommendations in the metadata service, we recommend pinning to the version we have out there, which I think is like 2015 7.25. So ideally, you should use the specific version, just because like latest is what we use to develop and make changes. And so obviously, as we make changes, what you have supported before might not work anymore. So just a fair warning of those using metadata service. There's going to be big changes coming out. I don't exactly know what they are, because I haven't been told about it. That's one of my things I'm going to do today, is learn about them and then document that versioning when that new one comes out. Real quick, sorry, Shannon, I want to warn people now. I know there is the caveat. I know I put it in the notes in the docs before that we always recommend picking a version because of this exact scenario we're about to run into, where if you've been using latest, it's going to break, because specifically I think we're going, I forget exactly what, we're going from one, either YAML to JSON or JSON to YAML, one of the two. Something's changing in that, and so that's my warning there. I just want to real quick, as I launch Convoy Gluster, this is something that has come up a bunch where I've had people say it doesn't work. The one thing that people kind of overlook, because we like pre-fill out all the defaults for you, is that you'll need to make sure to put in a host label that's valid. So if you don't put in a host label, like the Convoy Gluster won't be, some of the services in it won't be able to launch. So I'm just going to pick one that I know is, I have that existing, and then I'm going to launch it. That's just, we're making, I think, a change to Convoy Gluster to remove that requirement, just because we've had so many people just overlook it just from not reading it. So that's just my other PSA. Let everyone know.
Great. There was while that's finishing up loading, there was another question that was asked by Silart. I hope I'm saying that right. But he was asking about sharing stacks between environments, and do you use a catalog to share between environments? So there's a couple ways that so environments are. I think Denise touched on this earlier, but environments are truly isolated sets of resources. So while within an environment we have a private network, and we've got DNS management and service discovery, and all sorts of amazing stuff works within an environment. The two environments are really, individual environments are isolated each other in the same way that security groups are in Amazon, or availability zones are. They're really fully implemented. They're fully isolated. So if you want to connect from say you have a stack running in environment A, and you want to access a service that's running in environment B, you have to access that as what we call an external service. So if you're trying to connect two services that are in different places, you want to create an external service which allows you to connect to, say, an IP or a load balancer port, something that's actually exposed on that public, on that other service publicly, or on your network, or wherever the sort of high-level IP is that the host is on. So you can certainly do that, and that's the way to connect them. If you wanted to, and we've talked about doing some allowing for IPsec connections between environments, but right now we have not implemented that. So it's a feature request some people have asked for, is say, I'd like to be able to isolate and connect those independently. The other way to the other half of your question, I think, was, and maybe there's another way to interpret the question, is how do you share compose files between environments? And that is if you have like an application stack that you want to implement multiple times, like your MongoDB stack, and you want to implement it in environment 1, environment 2, environment 3, that is a great use case for the catalog. So as you create a catalog, you make it available to these, you make a stack available, then you can reinstantiate that same catalog item, in any environment that has access to that catalog. So yes, that definitely would work. Thanks for the good question. Okay, Denise, do you want to finish up what you were?
Yeah, I'm just finishing. I didn't want to launch anything without explaining it, just because though while you're talking, I just reviewing the documentation just to make sure we have it noted. So right now I have Gluster FS running, I have Convoy Gluster running, and they're both active and up and running. So now the next part is to actually use it. So I'm going to add a service. And the only changes I'm doing is basically I'm selecting my volume driver. So the name of the volume driver is the name of what the name of the storage pool is. I did notice I went to the storage pool page. The storage pool isn't showing up, whereas I think it used to. So I need to look into that after the call. But I'm going to trust the system. It'll work because it's worked for me before. And then I'm just going to create I'm going to name what the volume will be on the host. I'm going to call it Denise test. And then I'm going to name the folder that I want created on every container that we're going to launch. So I've asked it to run an instance of this container on every host. And then I'm going to start it up. So once this gets started, I can actually give the demo of, I'm going to go into one container. Okay, I can do a couple of things. First, I'll go into one of my GCE hosts. I can show you the volume that is created. That's step one. I can show you that Denise test that I named. Volume is created as a Docker volumes. The next thing I would do is I can go into the container itself. I'm going to add a file to it, and then I'll go to a different host and check if that container has that file as well. Let me first do that. Let's go into close this one, because this one is up. So if I do a Docker volume, you can see I have lots of local drivers, and I have my Convoy Gluster driver with my Denise test volume. That's up in, as it goes on into each of the hosts, it should create this volume into each host. So then this volume driver, and then start doing some fun things. I'm going to exec into here. You should be able to see up here we have our Denise folder. I go into there and crush. Obviously, it's not a YAML file, but here you can see my test files up there is in here. It's in my directory. So here we are on Convoy test, Convoy service 1_2, and that is coming from this Denise demo agent 1. So then I'm going to go, still starting on my DigitalOcean host. So I'll just go into my GCE host, the Denise demo agent 3. So I go into Convoy service, in here. I should be able to see once again the Denise directory, and then here you can see that that file is also available here. I could make changes here. New stuff. And show that I added a new line, and then if I go back to my previous one, I should be able to find my file. It shows that I've added some new stuff. I think that's really cool. Basically, it's all sharing, all my services, all the containers and services are sharing the same volume. So here's storage pools. There's definitely some kind of bug because normally by now I would be able to see my storage pools here. So I'm going to have to investigate. So I don't know. I don't think, Wolfgang, I've helped you much because I can't even get it to show up myself. It definitely was working for me before. So I'm going to take a look to see in my storage pool. It's here. It's not showing up on the UI. I'll have to look and talk to our UI guy, have them take a look at my environment to see why they're not showing up here. I don't know why they wouldn't be. They're all active too.
Yeah,
so maybe
maybe a bug in 51 because I definitely I'm using a 50 version of my lab and it's working fine. So
yeah.
maybe something that was reintroduced in the most recent release, something worth taking a look at.
So I'll bring it up with Vince, our UI developer, to see why my storage pools aren't showing up. So Wolfgang, I don't know if maybe you are using that version and having that issue. You could, I mean, probably you could go back to 50 and see it yourself if you wanted to. Otherwise, I'll definitely make sure that it gets corrected for the next release because obviously, I think the Convoy volume whole setup is so cool, and so to be able to see it is like obviously the way you'd be able to use it, or at least know that it's working in some way.
Okay, Denise, I think we're probably at a point where we should probably wrap it up. I think we've covered a ton of stuff. There's obviously a lot more we can go into, guys, and I think there was one last question that came in. Patrick asked about IPv6. Right now, I don't believe we have any support for IPv6 in the product yet, and I think on the planning side, it's something we've discussed and we've been looking at. So it is something we're talking about, but I don't think there's an ETA or anything I can tell you when we'll have IPv6 support for hosts for public IPv6. Denise, you don't know anything about that, do you?
No, I don't know. I just know that we don't support it. That's about all I know.
There is definitely a big discussion about it on GitHub. So if you wanted to kind of jump into that issue and kind of say how explain why it'd be valuable for you and kind of help us understand the use case, it's certainly something we'd like to support. It's just it's probably a little bit of a lower priority than a few other things right now. Otherwise, hopefully this has been really useful for everyone, and we've covered a lot of stuff to help you get up and get going with Rancher. As I mentioned before, we're going to keep this recording posted up onto YouTube. So if there's anything you want to watch again, feel free to visit it there. We try to post these every month, so you'll see other recordings. Also, we have our monthly online meetups where we go into a lot more depth on specific topics. For instance, this month we're having one next week around the same time where we'll be diving into how to deploy, how to build your own catalog items and how to do variable configuration and all sorts of more advanced topics. So if you haven't already, please register for that if you're interested, and we'll you can get a lot more information on that topic. We tend to run those every month, and they're fantastic. We really get a ton of great feedback, huge audiences, and really good response. So you can register for those just by going to rancher.com/events, and you'll see them. You do need to register for them, though, so take a look there. And otherwise, thank you, Denise, for diving into so much depth, and thank you everyone for attending. And good luck with your Rancher deployments. If you need any additional help, forums, docs, GitHub, those are great ways. Feel free to email us too. You can always email. I'm at Shannon@rancher.com. Denise is at Denise@rancher.com, and we're happy to help you any way we can. Otherwise, Denise, thanks.
No problem. Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
All right. Thank you.